Multi-core enhancement is an important topic that we've discussed before, right after the launch of the 8700K most recently. It'll become even more important over the next few weeks, and that's for a few reasons. For one, Intel is launching its new B and H chipsets soon, and that'll require some performance testing and validation. And for two, AMD is launching its Ryzen 2000 series chips on April 19th, and those will include XFR2. Some X470 boards, just like some X370 boards, will have MCE look-alike options, but they're not exactly the same. For Intel and AMD both, enabling MCE or core performance boost means running a higher clock speed, and depending on which setting you're talking about, it could exit specification, particularly the power specification, and that mostly applies for low-end coolers. The question is if any motherboard vendors enable MCE on Intel by default or silently, because that's where results can become muddy for buyers. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA and the X299 Dark motherboard for the Intel high-end desktop CPUs. The X299 Dark is one of the only motherboards on the market with proper VRM cooling. We've tested this and found a significant performance increase over those without active cooling on the VRMs. This board was used in our recent attempt to set a top 10 record in Firestrike, and you can learn more about the X299 Dark at the link in the description below. There's been a lot of updates since the last time we talked about multi-core enhancement, but again, the biggest one here is that we need to revisit it in preparation for B series and H series chipset testing, where we'll be looking at some of the previous Intel CPUs we've reviewed again, except on motherboards that are more appropriate for them. The i5 non-K CPU, the i3 non-K CPUs, those CPUs we've basically said from the start deserve to be on a non-Z series motherboard, and it's time to review those again, re-review those on the newer lower end boards so that we can get a realistic look at how they'll perform in a use case that makes sense. So ramping into that then, we wanted to revisit MCE. Part of revisiting MCE, as stated, is also in preparation for Ryzen 2, or the 2000 series Ryzen CPUs, which will be launching on April 19th. And for that launch, we'll be looking at some new performance options on X470 motherboards that weren't fully present or present in the same fashion on the original Ryzen CPUs. So we'll be looking at an R7 1700 today with core performance boost. It's not the same as MCE, but just looking at the name of it, it sounds the same. That's an option in most BIOS versions for X370 motherboards, and then we'll be looking at the i7 8700K with MCE, multi-core enhancement on the Intel motherboards. Before ramping into a lot of charts, there's a lot of data here. Some quick information on MCE and core performance boost. If you're not familiar with either, multi-core enhancement, or MCE, is basically a feature that's on some, not all, Intel motherboards, and it's a manufacturer-created feature. This is something that ASUS or Gigabyte or folks like that would have a hand in, not Intel. It's a non-Intel feature. And MCE is also a non-stock feature. Multi-core enhancement, by default, is basically built to run the CPU at its maximum single-core turbo, except across all cores. Generally speaking, actually always speaking, this will also increase your power consumption. So it will exit the power specification that is assigned by the CPU manufacturer. Core performance boost, meanwhile, on AMD motherboards is more to do with the precision boost and XFR features on Ryzen platforms and Ryzen CPUs. So it behaves a bit differently. The clock speed is still impacted, but it's impacted for a different reason. Rather than maxing out single core across all cores, what's happening is you are applying XFR and precision boost across the CPU as expected by AMD's specifications. Let's get into the test platform now before the numbers. So for testing, we only use Cinebench this time, and we've actually replaced Cinebench with Blender for all of our benchmarking for rendering application workloads. That's mostly because people actually use Blender as an application to make things and render things, and also because we found Blender to have a whole lot less variance. We also build our own in-house Blender benchmarks, so we have total control over them, which gives us a lot more confidence in testing. Cinebench, however, is good for a very quick and comparable synthetic benchmark. So we're using that today. In the course of running Cinebench, we ran it without any logging software at all for the Cinebench numbers we present. And then when we start presenting things like frequency, power characteristics, things like that, we use hardware info running while Cinebench is running, but we're not averaging in the results from those Cinebench runs while hardware info is running because it influences them a bit. So that's the first thing you need to know. Second thing you need to know is for components. For the Intel systems, what we're using are a couple of motherboards. We have an ASUS Maximus X Hero Z370 motherboard. We have a Gigabyte Z370 Ultra Gaming. We have an MSI Z370i Gaming Pro Carbon ITX board. For the Intel other components in that bench, we used an 8700K. It's delidded, but that's irrelevant here. And we also have, for memory, Corsair Vengeance LPX 3200 MHz at 1618-1836 for its XMP profile, XMP I guess, and that's 2x16 gigabyte sticks. We're also using an EVGA 750 watt Supernova G2 for the power supply and an EVGA 1080 Ti FTW3 for the graphics card, which is irrelevant, along with a Kraken X62 cooler, just to make sure we're not thermal throttling anywhere. For the AMD systems, we're using an ASUS Crosshair 6 Hero motherboard X370 on 6001 beta BIOS. We are also using an R7 1700 review sample. We're using the Guile 3200 MHz CL16 memory provided by AMD for the R5 review ages ago now. And for the power supply, an NZXT Hale 90 V2, GPU 1080 Ti FTW3, and cooler, also a Kraken X62. We moved on again from Cinebench for Blender previously, but now is a good time to reintroduce Cinebench for some of this testing. This testing started out with an ASUS Maximus X or Maximus X motherboard, which we received after the initial launch reviews of the i7-8700K. Our starting board was the Gigabyte Z370 Ultra Gaming. It was a shame too that we received the Maximus later, because we were able to overclock far better on the Maximus X, and that was with the help of reduced VDroop, which we had on early revisions of BIOS for the Gigabyte Ultra Gaming board, and better BIOS options, also a way better VRM on the Maximus motherboard. In fact, the Ultra Gaming was so problematic that Gigabyte is now introducing an Ultra Gaming Z370 V2 motherboard, V1.0. That's actually the name of it. It's the Ultra Gaming V2 1.0, as opposed to the Ultra Gaming V1 1.0, because we can't iterate on the 1.0, obviously, and make it 2.0. But there is a significant difference between them. So to be clear, we're using the original one, and for this first set of results, we'll look at the ASUS board. Here's our test matrix for the ASUS Maximus X motherboard. We ran tests for all the stuff in the charts here. The first one is complete auto settings as reset from default, not even with XMP. MCE is auto. Second one, auto settings with MCE explicitly disabled, still without XMP. Next one, DOCP enabled, the ASUS version of XMP presets, and then answering no to the prompt, MCE auto. Next one is DOCP enabled and answering no to the prompt, then disabling MCE explicitly. Next, DOCP enabled, answering yes to the prompt, MCE auto. And finally, DOCP enabled, answering yes to the prompt, MCE explicitly disabled. As you can see, there's a lot of testing going on here for just one board. So we have a lot of data to go through because there's Cinebench, frequency performance, and power performance for each motherboard. Note also that ASUS only offers auto or disabled for multi-core enhancement with the BIOS revision we're using, which is exceptionally confusing for the end user. We would strongly encourage ASUS to add an explicit enabled and disabled option, perhaps along with auto, as opposed to what presently exists, which is you can either choose off or LOL IDK. That's basically your two options, because auto doesn't tell you what it's going to do. So we'd like to see enabled and disabled explicitly, but that's what we have right now. After enabling XMP or DOCP, as ASUS calls it, ASUS will prompt you yes or no on further changes. We tested both options. Let's start with Cinebench scores. We'll look at frequency and power next. For the ASUS motherboard, we logged scores as seen on the screen now. With DOCP on, yes selected, and MCE set to auto, we scored 1445 multi-threaded average for Cinebench, or 197 single-threaded, and that's after multiple passes averaged. Selecting no but leaving DOCP on and MCE to auto, we scored within margin of error for Cinebench, which has a lot more variance than you'd expect, and thus is why we dropped it for the more reliable and usable Blender tests. Regardless, we're at 1443 and 199 here. Explicitly disabling MCE gives us another equivalent score, 1439 multi-threaded, 197 single-threaded. These are within margin of error of the first few tests. Explicitly disabling MCE and selecting no when prompted, we again land within margin of error, 1441 and 196. Going full stock, meaning no XMP on the memory, we landed at 1432 multi-threaded and 196 single-threaded. The MCE auto results were within margin of error of the MCE disabled results. After this, we sent an email to ASUS asking what MCE actually does on this motherboard, because it appears that on the version of BIOS we have, which we'll mention in the article as well, MCE does nothing right now. But we haven't tested the newest version of BIOS on this motherboard because we're trying to see what performance looked like with the first public release as opposed to our initial testing, which used a pre-release BIOS. We'll revisit this topic with the ASUS board later once all of the finalized Intel security patches come out and things like that. So this might come down to the beta BIOS or whatever we're running presently being bugged. But either way, we'll revisit the topic when ASUS ships a finalized BIOS version for upcoming CPUs. We would assume it'll have one. And or for security patches with Intel. Of course, those are getting updates as well. Let's look at frequencies just for validation. Looking at frequencies, DOCP yes and MCE auto resulted in an average single-threaded frequency of 4553.6 megahertz on the 8700K. Multi-threaded was 4299. This is expected and matches the Intel Turbo Boost table. DOCP no and MCE auto resulted in a single-threaded frequency of 4541.9 MHz within margin of error of our averaging and test-to-test variance. Multi-threaded was 4299. We're looking for differences equal to or in excess of 100 MHz. DOCP yes and MCE explicitly disabled gave us 4538 MHz single-threaded and multi-threaded was 4299. DOCP no, MCE explicitly disabled gave us 4556 and 4299 multi-threaded. This again is completely within Cinebench's relatively wide variance. We have an established range of about 23 MHz single-threaded and basically 1 MHz multi-threaded. Full stock settings with MCE off gave us 4567 MHz single or 4320 multi. The big difference here was disabling DOCP or XMP, resulting in a 20 MHz change. Still, this is not reaching those higher clock bins, and that's under auto. Auto settings with MCE set to auto gave us 4559 MHz single or 4319 multi. We chalk this up to being a potentially buggy BIOS, but we'll revisit this once BIOS is ratified and released publicly for the new CPUs coming out and for security patches. As for power consumption, also for validation, we observed approximately 104 to 108 watts consumption during multi-threaded workloads for all tests. The stock tests without XMP were closer to 96 watts. The range run-to-run was approximately 4 watts, which is within reasonable variance. ASUS's Maximus X results with the BIOS used seem to indicate that MCE is either bugged or non-functional with this set of testing. We'll have to revisit either older BIOS revisions or upcoming BIOS revisions for more. One final note, we previously did testing with MCE on the ASUS board and noted that it was functional, at least somewhat, but it seems to have been broken in one of the later revisions. And part of this is because in the earlier testing, we noted that some of the MCE tests would result in blue screens. I think that was with Blender, if I remember correctly, and that was because the CPU was running voltages too low for the frequencies MCE was pushing, thus causing an unstable overclock or a crash. And so we obviously recommended against using that and manually overclocking if that's what you wanted. Let's move on to Gigabyte. Gigabyte Z370 Ultra Gaming's next. This one took some extra effort because we had to dig up old pre-release BIOS revisions for testing, and these are BIOS revisions that we used during our review period and were important to digging deeper into MCE in a heavier fashion. Here's a chart of the test matrix for Gigabyte. First, BIOS F5 at complete stock, MCE auto. BIOS F5 at stock, MCE explicitly disabled. BIOS F5 with XMP enabled, MCE auto. F5 with XMP enabled, MCE disabled. F5 with XMP enabled, MCE enabled, and the first release BIOS F4 at stock, which came out publicly with the board, MCE auto, pre-release BIOS F3 at stock, MCE auto, and initial BIOS F2 with XMP and no MCE option present. Here's where it gets interesting. With that last option, with BIOS version F2, which is what the motherboard shipped with for the review units, or at least ours, the Gigabyte conversation we had previously, we explicitly asked if MCE was present on the board and whether it was disabled or enabled by default, and Gigabyte had indicated to us that they believed in completely disabling MCE for stock testing and noted that it would be disabled for this board by default. We also asked these questions because there was no MCE option in Gigabyte's F2 version of the BIOS. So even if you suspected it to be present, it wasn't something you could see or change from what we've seen with our review version of F2. And on that note, It took us a while to find version F2 because we saved it to an old USB key and fortunately still had it on there because it was a pre-release BIOS. It's not publicly available, and the later versions came out that were F4 and F5A were used for other testing. For game testing, we used BIOS revision F4 or beta F5A. These were explicitly switched to for game benchmarking, as we were told by Gigabyte that F4 and F5A would impact GTX 1080 and 1080 Ti performance on the Ultra Gaming. We'd already run our synthetic round on BIOS revision 2, and were told at the time that there shouldn't be any CPU-only performance differences between the revisions outside of the GPU performance issues. So then we ran F2 for Cinebench, POV Ray et al., but ran F5A or F4 for game testing. Let's get into the Cinebench numbers. For BIOS version F5, multi-threaded Cinebench performance lands us at 1423 points for F5, stock, XMP off, and MCE auto. There's an MCE option in F5, unlike F2. We received 193 for single-threaded. F5 stock, MCE disabled, got us 1421 points. This indicates that on at least EFI F5, MCE is disabled by default, as Gigabyte said, when left to auto. EFI F5 XMP on, MCE auto, we score 1427 points, reasonable as memory is now faster. F5 with XMP and MCE explicitly disabled further supports that MCE is disabled by default on version F5. F5 with XMP and MCE explicitly enabled gives us 1545 points multi-threaded, finalizing that MCE is disabled by default on version F5. And we then tested EFI version F4. At complete stock, MCE auto, we scored 1423 and 193 points, and that again shows MCE is off by default with F4. EFI version F3, same thing, same performance. And then after digging through those old flash drives to find F2 BIOS revision, we found the culprit here. There's no MCE option in this BIOS revision, and although Gigabyte did later embrace that MCE should be disabled by default, the initial BIOS revision had no MCE option, and MCE was in fact enabled by default, silently, and there was no way to explicitly disable it in that version of BIOS that shipped on our board anyway. So then, all the scores would be in the 1500s for Cinebench and still faster for single-threaded at 204. The same is true for XMP enabled with EFI F2. EFI revision F2 with MCE automatically enabled ends up with a performance uplift of approximately 7.7 to 7.8% over stock for Cinebench, as we're reaching the max turbo frequency for one core, but applied to all cores. And for frequency, here's what we saw. For EFI F5, all instances with MCE off or MCE auto, we had a frequency of 4300 megahertz, all core, the correct value given Intel's frequency tables that are publicly visible through XTU. They're not hiding them, but they're also not really pushing them anymore. Package power consumption was approximately 87 watts. Explicitly enabling MCE in F5 resulted in 4700 megahertz frequency. This exit stock spec naturally gives a boost of 7.8%. Again, we used F4 and F5A for our gaming tests, and the behavior is correct with MCE auto on these revisions. For EFI F2, the frequency matches EFI F5 with MCE enabled, 4700 megahertz all core. Power consumption also goes up with the higher frequencies and voltages, naturally. We're at 87 watts average for MCE disabled or 115 for enabled. The next question is why? Why did Gigabyte ship like this with F2 enabling MCE by default and also not having an option to disable it? Well, we talked to Gigabyte back then, and we also talked to a lot of other motherboard makers at the time, and we've revisited the topic now. But basically, when we released our initial MCE benchmark video months ago around the time of the 8700K review, motherboard makers noted to us that they were anxious that their competitors, other motherboard makers, would enable MCE by default, which of course pushes them to consider enabling MCE by default. This is because the motherboard vendors, particularly the higher-ups as we understand it, don't want to look at charts of reviews of Intel processors and see that their motherboards are scoring lower than their competitors when there's really no good reason for that to be the case, aside from BIOS differences. Well, there's one good reason, it turns out. Of course, it's MCE. So that's why you see some of the boards or some of the earlier BIOS revisions enabling MCE by default. It's because the board makers were concerned that they would look bad in charts because their competitors ran CPUs functionally out of spec. Now, fortunately, it looks like some of these have been turned around. Gigabyte has corrected this and disabled MCE by default on later revisions of BIOS. So we give Gigabyte credit for that at least, but it would have been nice to have it properly done the first time. Either way, it was just a day or two before the review went live that another BIOS revision came out, F4 or F5A, and the revision also fixed some GPU performance issues, so we use that for game testing. The motherboard vendors here want to compete with each other. It's not some Intel-driven plot or conspiracy to make Intel CPUs look better. This comes down to motherboard manufacturers, and it's up to really everyone to make sure that MCE stays disabled by default, as it should be, for motherboards, because from the folks we've spoken with, it sounds like there's pressure internally for MCE to be enabled if any of the competing motherboard makers decide to enable it by default, because they'll instantly make everyone else look worse if MCE isn't discussed in that equation. So they're mostly competing. That's what it comes down to. We always aim to test with MCE disabled. We were told it was disabled with the Ultra Gaming version F2. Clearly that wasn't the case. But fortunately, the gaming results remain accurate on BIOS version F4 and F5A, which came out a bit later and included 1060, 1070, 1080, and up performance fixes that were present on BIOS version F2. As for what we think of MCE here, we're a bit disappointed that motherboard makers even think about enabling MCE automatically by default at all, because in some testing we've done, again, you can experience blue screens, instability, and crashes, and if you're an end user who maybe knows nothing or little about BIOS, that's not an option you'd think to disable. There is zero reason, as an uninformed user, you'd think, my system's blue screening, I'm gonna go into BIOS, and then you'd see an option called, this makes everything better, and disable it. There's no reason you would do that. Because multi-core enhancement doesn't sound like something that causes a blue screen. It sounds quite good. And if it's on auto, why would you change it? So we strongly believe it needs to be off. It's unfortunate that some of the vendors have defaulted it to on, but it does look like most of them are actually moving to default by off by now. So later Z370 Ultra Gaming revisions, for example, were part of that. And all of this comes down to voltage tables, LLC tables as well. Under auto settings, not always the best, as we've discussed before. You'll have to keep a careful eye on this for B&H boards, but more importantly for Ryzen 2000 CPUs with XFR2, something we'll be looking at, and we have some data on that we can share later, of course. The last Intel board we tested was the MSI Z370i Gaming Pro Carbon, which has EFI version 7B43 version 11 installed. We only needed 2 tests for this one, so it'll be quick. With stock settings, our Cinebench score was 1430.7 points, or 196 single-threaded. Enabling XMP gave us an expected uplift to 1439. That's all we needed to test. We did not see an MCE option on this board, but some manufacturers actually do auto-enable MCE with XMP, or have in the past, so we wanted to at least make sure nothing similarly sneaky was going on with the Z370i and XMP. This one seemed fine. Moving on to the ASUS Crosshair 6 Hero. This is an AMD Ryzen motherboard, and this has an R7 1700 in it. We tested with the following configurations. First, we used stock with CPB Auto, performance bias disabled. Note that ASUS calls the feature Core Performance Boost for AMD boards, but as Core Performance Boost is too long to fit in charts, we're calling it CPB. We next tested XMP with CPB Auto and performance bias disabled, then XMP with CPB disabled explicitly and performance bias disabled, finally XMP with CPB enabled explicitly and CB15 bias. The results for Cinebench are on the screen now. With Core Performance Boost set to auto, stock settings without XMP, and performance bias disabled, we measured 1400 points for multi-threaded and 145 for single-threaded. Enabling XMP but leaving the other options auto and disabled, we measured 1432 points and 148 points, boosted from higher memory speeds. Enabling XMP and explicitly disabling Core Performance Boost, we measured LEET.7 points multi-threaded or 123 for single-threaded. Finally, enabling Core Performance Boost and Cinebench Bias, we measured 1472 points multi-threaded, a substantial uplift, and 151 points single-threaded. Here are the frequencies. With Core Performance Boost enabled, we ended up at 3154 multi or 2815 single. With it disabled, we're at 3000 multi or 2662 single. We always test with Core Performance Boost enabled on AMD Ryzen platforms, but it's not the same as MCE. For AMD, Core Performance Boost seems to trigger Precision Boost and XFR, as noted previously, which are both stock features of AMD Ryzen by default, and so it makes sense that the motherboards enable CPB by default. This is a different feature from Intel's CPUs and how they interact with MCE. We do, however, leave the biases off, as those are motherboard one-offs. Power does exit spec as defined by TDP, but remember that TDP is not equivalent to actual power consumption. Looking at this power chart, what we see is that we measured about 68.7 watts, close to the 65 watt TDP, again, not really the same thing, but either way, and 26 watts for single-threaded. This was with CPB disabled. With CPB enabled, the default option, we measured 79 watts multi, 33 watts single. And just a quick recap, for TDP, it's more a measure of how much cooling power, not really the best word, but how much cooling prowess, we'll call it, is required to keep a CPU within spec, as opposed to how much power is drawn. So the two numbers are not technically the same. However, they are very close. It tends to be the case that TDP is within single-digit percentages of the actual power consumption. So recapping here, why does it happen? Motherboard vendors are competing to try and keep up with each other. Some of them have in the past enabled MCE by default. There are probably some boards out there that still do it, but we haven't run into any yet. And on the motherboard vendor side, it's just not wanting to look bad in comparison. So everyone needs to kind of make sure that MCE stays off. It's really on us, because what happens is once a motherboard vendor enables MCE by default, as Gigabyte did with BIOS version F2 before they later changed it, and thank you Gigabyte for doing that, what happens is other vendors will see those results, freak out about why their performance looks bad when all they do is make a motherboard, all they do, quotes, make a motherboard, and then enable MCE on their own. So that's kind of the concern here. It's not an Intel hidden secret narrative. It's not Intel trying to control the motherboard makers. It's motherboard makers independently competing with one another. So, and ultimately executives at the top looking and seeing their boards lower on the charts and not understanding why. For future testing, for our own testing, we're going to standardize a couple of new procedures to ensure that motherboards and manufacturers aren't unintentionally or intentionally pulling one over on us. So a couple things here. One, we're going to begin taking note and detailing which EFI version we used for the CPU and motherboard in the review. We tend to do this internally, but it's probably a good time to start putting that external for validation reasons and because really the BIOS makes a huge impact on performance. So that's an important thing. We now believe that it's basically just as important as listening to what GPU we use. So we're going to start putting that in the test tables, which will help isolate problems in the future that are BIOS related. Two, going to begin exporting the BIOS when possible and saving it somewhere so that we can ensure we have permanent access to pre-production BIOS revisions, because the review BIOS is important to keep around because we need to see if they did anything tricky or different or weird in that BIOS and make sure we have it for later. Fortunately, we still had all the old BIOSes from previous flashes, but we're going to save them internally explicitly now to make sure of that for all future BIOSes as well. And three, we usually conduct a fully automated test suite for synthetics and production workloads, including Blender. We'll keep doing that because it is highly accurate. You can repeat stuff really easily, but we're also now adding in some additional hardware info logging. So this is going to be a separate run. As stated previously, hardware info can impact performance results. We are not going to be including hardware info for the test path used in the results averaging, but we're going to be using them to average, or to validate rather, CPU frequencies, voltages, and cache memory behaviors, things like that, which will just be a completely separate, isolated run to give us a bunch of data that we can then crawl through, validate, make sure everything's performing to spec and not doing anything tricky. One more thing, we're going to go back and correct some of the old Cinebench charts on POV-Ray that use the Gigabyte F2 BIOS and make sure they're reflected with the new data based on what we found here today. So that's, I think that's about the deepest dive you'll get on MCE so far for the specific motherboards we're looking at today. We're going to keep a close eye on this for the B and H motherboards. You could assume coming soon based on the leaks that have been out there. And for the Ryzen 2000 CPUs, you could also assume coming soon. And we have got a couple of other really cool content pieces coming up this week. So make sure you subscribe for those. As always, go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. And go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our new mod mats. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.